Hello, Tony Hollins here. You're listening to Chain Reaction, all about supply chain advantage. And we've got some interesting stories popping along in this episode today, so stick around, stay tuned, and find out more. And I hope you're going to listen and enjoy the show. And if you like Chain Reaction, subscribe. You'll be first to know when new episodes are coming your way, so give it a shot. Well, you might think that tariffs have dropped out of the news, but of course they're still having quite an effect around the globe. And I was looking at some news of what's happening with steel tariffs. The UK, of course, signed an agreement with the United States, and that was to reduce tariffs below what other countries were getting. And some of those tariffs have come into force in July, or will come into force in July. And although they are beneficial against other tariffs, they're still putting the cost of goods up and making trade more frictionful. And that means that it will slow things down, people will have to plan carefully, and they can't trust what the US government is doing with tariffs. And I was reading about a Sheffield steel manufacturer who has a plant in the United States where they make steel, but they can't get the raw material into that plant because of the steel tariffs that are imposed by the US government on the raw material coming from Sheffield. And that could put 70 jobs at risk in the United States. So already these tariffs seem, well, gotta say it, not very well thought out, and it needs to be reconsidered. I think the Trump administration is too simplistic in the way they've applied these tariffs, and they don't understand the interconnections in the trade and what it will actually impact in the industry that they're trying to place the tariff on. And more importantly, they don't understand the impact of what will happen to the United States in all of this. So they think they're protecting the United States when they're probably causing harm, and they'll probably damage trade in the United States, and they'll place jobs at risk. So it doesn't seem a very clever idea. You'd have to ask what Trump's objective is here. Is it to raise revenue, as he originally said? Is it to protect the US industry against unfair competition, which he claims, which doesn't stand up to scrutiny? And where's it all going to end? There's stop, there's start, there's labels being thrown around like taco Trump, always chickens out. And this isn't helping anybody who's in industry. It isn't helping small businesses, it isn't helping medium-sized businesses, and although large businesses can probably stand the heat to the feet, it's unlikely that they're very pleased with what's happening either. And of course this will have a backlash politically, I would have thought, at some stage for the president and his administration. But there's so many other things going on in the world at the moment. It all seems terribly volatile. And when the world and global trade is volatile at the same time, then that means only one thing. It means inflation, it means cost, it means unemployment, it means lots of risks, and it's subject to sudden lurches in demand, supply. The whole thing becomes very difficult to sustain. I'm reminded when I listen to the problems with tariffs about my industrial economics course I took when I was an undergraduate student. And one of the most interesting things for me to actually study was something called input-output analysis. And this was a real eye-opener because I'd thought about connections, but I hadn't thought about them in the way that input-output analysis demonstrated that they were important to every industry. And when you track the inputs and the outputs from each part, each stage of the process in an industry, you begin to see those connections and the interconnections and how value is created, or how cost travels through the whole system, or how it can be impacted from outside policies, the sort of policies that President Trump and his administration have imposed on the United States, thinking they're doing one thing, which is to protect the United States economy, which they propose, but actually doing a lot of damage, which is not the intention. And that's where that very important phrase, unintended consequences, comes from. And I think what's happening here, perhaps, are unintended consequences of the policies being imposed by Trump and his colleagues. So, be damage aware. Input-output analysis is a useful method for examining the relationship between different sectors of an economy or a system, and it's often used in economics, environmental studies, and systems thinking. It's a quantitative economic technique. It represents the flow of goods and services between sectors within an economy, and it maps how the output from one industry becomes the input for another, forming a network of interdependencies. It's useful in global trade to analyze how trade policy affects intersectoral linkages, for example, tariffs on steel, and the ripple effects through construction and manufacturing in a circular economy model. It closes the loop in supply chains by tracing waste outputs, re-entering as usable inputs. In energy pricing, it can assess how energy cost changes cascades across production systems, and it can also be useful for ESG tracking, looking at the emissions and to quantify those emissions embodied in supply chains by sector-level input-output models. So it can be very useful in modeling the economic impacts. For example, in steel, the steel industry buys iron ore. It's an input, and it sells steel to the construction sector, which is an output. The construction sector then builds infrastructure used by all others, multiplying that initial input throughout the economy. And you can look at the impact through a matrix analysis. So input-output analysis is often represented as a matrix, where a row shows output distributed across sectors, and each column shows inputs required from all sectors. So for example, if we've got a table and it looks like this, we've got a sector and it's steel, second sector construction, and the third one energy. You can then track the steel inputs into construction and into energy. So steel, for example, might use 0.2 steel, construction 0.3, and energy 0.1. And that way you can build up a picture of what's happening in those interconnections. Each value reflects the input from a sector required to produce one output unit in another sector. Input-output analysis was developed by Vasily Leontiev, a Russian-American economist, and he introduced the techniques in the 1930s and later expanded it to model complex economic systems using matrices. His pioneering work allowed economists and policymakers to better understand how changes in one sector ripple through the entire economy. His groundbreaking contribution earned him the Nobel Prize in Economic Science in 1973, specifically for developing this method and applying it to the United States economy. Pity he's not around today to help out this Trump administration see those interconnections. His models laid the foundation for later developments in computable general equilibrium models, environmental economic accounting, and life cycle assessment.
Chain reaction.
Now let's turn our attention to another news item which was brewing for some time. A few weeks back, the Air India plane, which was a Boeing Dreamliner jet, crashed, and as yet we don't know the cause of the crash, and an investigation is currently taking place. Now, the Dreamliner was supposed to be one of the safest planes made by Boeing, and the track record until this crash was very good. But of course, Boeing's been a troubled company for some time, and one of the major problems of Boeing seemed to be quality and quality issues. And on Chain Reaction, I've discussed those quality issues over the past couple of years. So it's not a new phenomenon, and many employees of Boeing, including engineers and people that have worked there for a long, long time, have been singing out that There are problems with the way the company makes the planes. It's the processes. They've stripped out talent and they've stripped out checks, all in the quest for cost saving. And those cost saving strategies may have cost the company its reputation. The new CEO is certainly trying to fix things, and he's got a good team around him, which will probably mean that Boeing's future will be secured. And Boeing is such a big, important aircraft company, too important to let go. And I'm sure the US government will not let Boeing decline into oblivion. And we're far from that yet. But obviously, the quality problems need to be sorted out, and there needs to be some humility on the part of the company to listen to those people who are long-standing, qualified, experienced employees who just happened to become whistleblowers because they felt it necessary to do that. In recent years, Boeing's recurring quality issues have exposed more than just manufacturing flaws. They've revealed systemic cracks in supply chain governance, cultural alignment, and leadership accountability. For supply chain professionals, the lessons are urgent and far-reaching. Let's take a deeper look. Firstly, let's take a look at the impact of systemic risk in distributed supply chains. Boeing's model is a masterclass in complexity. Thousands of parts, hundreds of suppliers, and a tightly orchestrated production timeline. Yet this very complexity became its Achilles heel when oversight mechanisms failed to keep pace with operational scale. A single faulty door plug triggered global scrutiny, proving that local errors can rapidly become global reputational risks. Systems thinking reminds us, if you only measure the visible, you'll miss where the real risks lie. There's also been what we call cultural drift and the collapse of engineering wisdom. Post-McDonnell Douglas merger, Boeing shifted from an engineering-first ethos to a finance-first mentality, and it's been well documented. The result, of course, a growing dissonance between corporate KPIs, key performance indicators on the ground, quality performance. Internal reports surfaced, warnings were raised, but psychological safety to escalate issues had eroded. Cultural misalignment, like defective parts, doesn't stay hidden forever. And what about ESG and the hidden costs of non-compliance? Boeing's case isn't just a safety story, it's an ESG story. The company stumbled on the governance pillar, but also the social, from workforce well-being to stakeholder trust. If we measure emissions but ignore erosion in ethical oversight, we miss the full picture of what supply chain responsibility entails. Total quality management isn't a relic. In fact, Boeing's saga underscores the need to embed quality, not as a department, but as a mindset. High reliability organizations like Toyota show us that quality is culture-driven, not compliance-driven. Supply chain resilience begins with respect for process, for people, and for the product, as well as the planet, of course. Some final thoughts: rethinking risk and responsibility. Supply chain professionals now need boardroom fluency, not just in metrics, but in complex systems, cultural cues, and ESG translation. Boeing's experience is not unique, but it is uniquely instructive. Another story that caught my eye this week was that Shell were rumoured to be interested in taking over BP. But by the time I'd read the story, Shell had withdrawn. But there are other suitors around, I think, and we'll have to keep an eye on this to see how it develops. Well, the US trade tariff deadline looms. The 90-day pause on President Trump's proposed reciprocal tariffs ends on July the 8th, with over 80 countries potentially affected. The US is demanding reduced reliance on Chinese inputs, elimination of non-tariff barriers, for example on digital service taxes, biosecurity rules, greater market access for US goods and services. Developing nations like Bangladesh, Cambodia and Lesotho may face tougher choices, balancing US demands with Chinese trade ties. In India, US trade talks are on a last-minute push. India and the United States are scrambling to finalise a partial trade deal before July the 9th, which is the deadline. There are some key sticking points. The US wants full access to India's dairy and agriculture sectors. India is pushing to protect labour-intensive exports like garments and jewellery. A limited agreement may be signed soon, with broader negotiations continuing into the autumn. As for the UK-US deal, it faces a new hurdle. The UK's alcohol advertising ban, part of a new NHS health plan, is drawing fire from US drinks giants. Washington may trigger formal dispute mechanisms under the new UK-US trade deal, which recently slashed tariffs on automotive and aerospace exports. Industry insiders warn this could escalate into a full-blown trade dispute if not resolved diplomatically. By July the 8th, over 180 countries could face sweeping US tariff penalties as tariff reviews expire. But buried in the noise of decoupling and digital disputes lies a quieter opportunity: relocalization as a catalyst for circular supply chains. In the rush to reduce reliance on Chinese inputs, many nations are rethinking how and where value is created. Could a shift towards regional hubs, closer to both suppliers and consumers, not only improve resilience, but also align with ESG imperatives? What looks like friction might actually be the spark for sustainable innovation. The question is, are we ready to seize it? The US growing debt mountain is a particular problem presently. Total national debt is over $36.2 trillion at mid-2025. The debt maturing in 2025 is a staggering $9.2 trillion, or 25.4% of the total debt, and the interest payments will now exceed $1 trillion annually, putting pressure on discretionary spending. Congress is debating a $4 to $5 trillion increase to avoid default, with extraordinary measures already in play. Now you might ask the question, why does this matter? Well, much of the maturing debt was issued at times when interest rates were extremely low, and rolling it over now at yields of above 3% means that higher borrowing costs puts more strain on the federal budget and potentially crowding out private investment. There are economic policy concerns, and volatility and uncertainty isn't helping. The new administration's on-off tariffs policy and abrupt regulatory shifts and near shutdowns have rattled markets. Consumer sentiment has plunged. It's down 22% since December 2024, with expectations falling even further. It's a monetary tightrope. The Fed's 5.5% to 5.75% interest rate is the highest in 2 decades. And of course, you'll have heard the president trying to put undue pressure on the Fed chair to lower those interest rates because he's so concerned about his own policies. While inflation has cooled consumer spending and business investment is weakening, especially in credit-sensitive sectors like housing and manufacturing. There are structural deficits. The US hasn't run a budget surplus since 2001, with deficits projected to widen. Debt to GDP is on track to exceed 120%. Proposed tax cuts and expanded tariffs could inflate the deficit by $3.8 trillion over the next decade. For supply chains, rising debt and policy unpredictability may accelerate regionalization and risk diversification, and this could be a potential boon for circular economy models. For ESG, fiscal constraints could deprioritize climate investments, but also open up space for private sector leadership. For global trade, the US's internal volatility may weaken its negotiating power, giving rise to alternative trade blocs and non-dollar settlements. The BRIC nations, of course, have been trying to exploit this weakness, but so far they haven't succeeded. When you look at global trade, it's always interesting to see what the retailers say, because they have the finger on the pulse and they know what's happening quite often before almost everybody else does, because they see what's happening in practice. And this week, I was intrigued to read that Stuart Machin, CEO of Marks & Spencer, recently slammed the latest post-Brexit food labelling rules as bureaucratic madness, highlighting the growing friction in supply chains between Britain and Northern Ireland. And here's what he said and why it matters. From the 1st of July, over 1,000 Marks & Spencer products sent to Northern Ireland must carry a Not For EU label. An additional 400 products will face extra checks under the so-called Red Lane system. And these requirements stem from the Windsor Framework, the UK-EU agreement designed to manage trade across the Irish Sea, while protecting the EU single market. Posting on X, Machin said, "Quite frankly, it's bureaucratic madness, confusing for customers and completely unnecessary, given the UK has some of the highest food standards in the world." He emphasised that the new rules add unnecessary cost and red tape for retailers and called for urgent progress on the UK's sanitary and phytosanitary SPS deal with the EU, which could eventually eliminate the need for such labels. The strategic implications of this: regulatory divergence is now a tangible cost driver in UK-EU trade. The labelling regime could become a case study in how non-tariff barriers disrupt integrated supply chains. And there's the broader question of consumer trust and clarity, especially when food standards aren't the issue, but market access rules are. So, all seems crazy, and you will know that I had an episode out on trying to get rid of red tape. And the UK government, of course, has said in its industrial strategy only last week that they want to get rid of red tape. And here we are, with all this red tape, tying people in knots and causing unnecessary cost and friction in supply chains. Well, that's it for this episode. I could go on longer, because there's just so much to get through, but you have to be very selective on a program like this to give listeners a flavour of the main things happening in those global supply chains, which they can gain insight, information, and perhaps turn into action of their own. So, I'm Tony Hines, I'm signing off, and I'll see you next time in Chain Reaction. Until then, take care, watch out for those supply chain disruptions and anything else in supply chains that cause grief, usually by outside influences, often policymakers taking actions that they think are in a perfectly good interest, but actually turn out to damage trade and, of course, cause friction in supply chains. Well, there we are. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.
You've been listening to the Chain Reaction podcast, written, presented and produced by Tony Hines.